This week's guest is Julian Rose. Julian is an author and pioneer in organic methods of farming, and I'll let him explain more about his very varied and extremely interesting background. Julian, you're very welcome to Alchemy Radio. How are you?
I'm very well. Yes, in fact, rude good health, I think the expression is.
Well, rude good health is a fine, robust expression and one I'm very fond of, and I'm feeling the same despite the battering that our respective geographical locations are getting weather-wise at the moment. Tell us about where you are and what's happening.
Well, I'm based on, I have an organic farm based in South Oxfordshire, which incidentally, listeners might be interested to hear, we were amongst the forerunners in organic farming. I started converting this farm in 1975, would you believe? And at that time, there were no organic standards. No one knew what organic was even.
Yeah.
And there were about 7 of us who were registered to be official organic farmers via the Soil Association, which was the charity established just after the Second World War to try and promote organic agriculture. And I slowly converted my farm over a 10-year period, and we've been organic ever since. So it's a wonderful place, John. I mean, if listeners could see it, they'd love it. There is a website, and maybe at the end of the show I'll give the details of it.
Yeah.
But we're right down at the Thames at the bottom end, and we're up to about 300 feet in the hills at the other end. And it's very hilly, and the soil's very thin, and it's very stony. It's a very difficult farm to farm, but it's a staggeringly beautiful place. Half forestry, half farmland. But the bottom end near the Thames is underwater completely already. You know, it looks a little bit like the pictures you've seen recently, maybe in the news of the Somerset levels. The whole of that Thames Valley is going more and more and more underwater. And we've got about 40 acres of permanent pasture underwater. The cattle have been moved up into the higher ground, so there's no real problem there. But it is a very dramatic scenario, and I think it's going to really remind people of bigger issues which are at stake on this planet.
And we are going to look at some of those bigger issues in some depth, Julian. But before we do, if you wouldn't mind, let's have a little bit about your background and how was it that you became one of the first organic farmers around the mid-70s? What was it something that was always at the forefront of your family life growing up, or how did you get from where you were to where you are now? Because I think a lot of people would be very interested in that.
Well, that's a very important question and a very good one. As a matter of fact, it's a very unusual route. Because I grew up in a family of 4. I had an elder brother and 2 elder sisters, and I'm the youngest, actually. And my parents my father had inherited this land. It's a country estate, really, you'd call it, of around 900 acres, with little cottages and farmland and forestry. And I was going through the school system. Luckily, I have to tell listeners, I failed to get into the private schools I was supposed to be sent to, i.e. Eton, which probably saved my life, actually. And I went off to another school where all sorts of types of people mixed with each other, rubbed shoulders. And I learned from a young age, that we're all very similar to each other, and the sort of class issue and the money issue is a facade, which if you can break through it and establish real relationships with people, you don't need to go back to that facade again. It's far more important to go heart to heart. I started learning that at the school, which is quite a good place, really. And I got very involved in drama there, drama and sport. I wasn't very academic. And out of that, masters at the school said you might have a future for yourself in drama if you ever wanted to go that way as an actor. And I wasn't sure, but what happened defined my life almost for me, because when I was 16, my elder brother was killed in an amateur motor racing accident. And 2 years later, my father died of a stroke, aged 53. And all of a sudden, I was the inheritor, I was the new owner of this Hardwick estate. And it was very overwhelming. Yeah. First of all, of course, it was overwhelming to lose my brother and my father, but it was as overwhelming yet again to suddenly find myself responsible for this large area of land. But I was very fortunate in that my mother, who was very, very capable and made a great job of looking after things here, was able to say to me, look, Julian, you need to go your own way for a while, it's obvious, and find what it is you want to do in life. I can manage here with the help of various assistants, and people who have expertise in the areas of farming. And I did. I went off to Australia, actually. I wanted to get far away from England, believe it or not. And I landed up there working on a large cattle station as a jackaroo, they call it. And it was an incredible place. I remember it was in North Queensland. And the cattle station was the same size as Wales. Wow. And I didn't think it was particularly big. You know, it is with these sort of crazy things. But there I met the Aboriginal people. And I had a wonderful rapport with them, just wonderful people. I mean, so deep, so humorous, always joking and smiling, and this incredible knowledge of the land. Absolutely every last detail that they understood, in stark contrast to the farm manager, who was a white Australian and could only think about how to kick these people around and try and make the maximum amount of money.
Right.
And then I landed up after that working for Australian Broadcasting Commission for a while in the production department, and then returned to England, where I did actually land up going to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art and studying acting and stage management. And out of that, I got involved in traditional theatre for a little bit, repertory theatre, as an actor stage manager. And then I went to America, and I joined up with an experimental theatre company, which was doing very remarkable type of work. We were working with very few actors playing lots of different roles, including the roles of wind and trees and wild weather and sea and landscape, and the people that move through it, the actual characters. So that was beginning to satisfy a deeper thing in me, which was beginning to emerge. But always in the background of my mind was, I have to come back and take on this estate. So I'm trying to get to the point to tell everybody that when I came back to England, I got involved with the Soil Association. Actually, I was working abroad in Belgium, which is where the theatre company, which was originally in America, it moved to Belgium, and we had an international company based there. Actually, we had a school where we were teaching children academic subjects and artistic subjects overlapping each other. And we were also touring from there. And a lecturer came to this place, Antwerp, in Belgium, in 1975, and gave a lecture called The Laws of the Land. And it was about something called organic farming. And it's sheer good luck that I happened to see a poster announcing that lecture, because I went, and when I heard what it was about, and when I heard the issues and how about it's working with nature rather than against nature, you know, I suddenly sort of got a flash, and I thought, that's it. That's what I'm supposed to do. When I get back to England, I'm just going to put myself 100% into this. And that's exactly what I did. Straight from acting, experimental theatre into farming, 1975.
What an interesting path. And when you arrived back then in the UK, it must have been not a culture shock, but a big change for those around you with your newfound knowledge and your newfound interest. Because as you mentioned, I mean, this is 40 years ago, give or take. It just wasn't a done thing, and people didn't have knowledge of it. It wasn't necessarily, I would imagine, that there was a resistance to it, but it was just so new, and we all know what a lot of people are like when it comes to change. How was the change for those around you, and was it seen as radical or as something negative, or did people embrace it with open arms? And what were the first steps, I suppose, Julian?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it was pretty amazing, actually. I think people thought I was pretty crazy. That was essentially what it was. My mother most certainly didn't, because, and nor did my family, my sisters. They understood the principle of it. They loved the land. After all, they'd grown up there too. And they knew how beautiful it was. And of course, they wanted it to be looked after, but they didn't understand the details of how you do it. But so they weren't against it. But when it came to dealing with other local farmers whose support I actually needed, like a farmer to bring a combine harvester in to harvest my first crops and everything, they were just saying, well, why would you want to go back? You know, why would you want to go backwards? We've been through all that stuff. You know, make life easier for yourself. Use herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, nitrate fertilizers and things. You know, this is just going backwards. So I paid no attention to that. I was terribly excited, actually, at that time, and I got a great push of energy, and I absolutely knew that this was the right thing. And I sort of pushed on. And what we did was, there were only about 5 or 6 of us in the country, and we actually tended to visit each other and learn from each other to try and avoid making the most obvious mistakes. And then I pored over all the old literature about traditional family farming. And pre-war literature was much the best, stuff written in the 1920s and 30s and even 40s, which talked about, crop rotations, how much farmyard manure to put back on the land, how to maintain the diversity of your hedges, how to keep your cattle healthy without the use of antibiotics and all that sort of thing. There was so much to delve into. And what I did was, John, it was fascinating actually. There was a wonderful woman who's still alive on my farm. She's aged 97 years old now. She lives in a farm cottage on the farm itself. She was in her 60s at that time, and she taught me how to manage a dairy herd. But that dairy herd at that time was just 3 cows, okay. Millie, Valley, and Bugle. Millie and Valley were 2 Guernseys, and Bugle was a Frisian cow. And I didn't go for the Frisians. I noticed there was black and white everywhere in the countryside, and they were sort of mass production cows.
Yeah.
But I really fancied those Guernseys. Beautiful animals. Lovely, soft brown and white colouring. Very, very gentle. Good milk producers. Very high butter fat. Fabulous cream. And so I said to Betty J, her name was, I said, Miss Betty, I'm going to go with these, and I'm going to gradually increase the herd based on these, and I'm going to sell all my milk unpasteurised, organic and local. And I'm going to do a delivery round myself, and I'm going to milk the cows myself, I'm going to bottle the milk myself, and we'll have to learn this in a hands-on way. And that is how I got started, John, believe it or not. And it went from there into, I'll start with a few free-range hens. And, actually, a neighbour interested in running some, gave him a bit of land. Okay, started free-range hens. I included those on my milk round. And then I had someone else who was interested in pigs who worked with me a little while. I said, all right, you buy the pigs and I'll buy them from you if you don't want to stay very long. And he didn't stay very long, so I bought the size from him, and then we started getting free-range pork, organic pork, and it spread and spread and spread until eventually the whole farm, which is around about 350 acres, was converted into a very, very mixed organic farm where the quality of the products coming off it was very high. And the interest in the product after 10 years of doing this was just beginning to be real. Because obviously at the beginning, no one really knew what they were getting or why they should eat it as opposed to anything else. It took a very long time to make people aware of the dangers of the factory farm, the mass processing industry, the supermarket global network of food production and consumption, which is destroying the health of a vast percentage of humanity to this day. Yes, an amazing story, I have to admit.
It really is. And for those first 10 years, were there ever times of frustration or times where you thought, well, am I just banging my head against a brick wall here because this isn't catching on? Because 10 years is quite a long time. And I mean, it does show the dedication that you had to the ideas and to put them into practice for that length of time, and only then a decade later feel that you're getting some kind of traction must have been quite difficult at times.
It was, actually. And the difficulty was really that, this is an issue of economics as well. If it was nice if one had a lot of money in the background and just had been able to do it regardless, but we had to actually make this pay. And that is why I started very small. And I advise anybody who ever considers going into food and farming, always start small, because if you go wrong when you're small, you don't lose much money,
Yeah.
If you go wrong when you're big, you can make a serious problem for yourself. And I was determined not to take loan. And so I really built up very, very slowly. And it was actually very funny. You'd laugh. Going back in my mind and memories of it, when I set it off my little second-hand Renault van delivering milk, I had, 2 of those 3 cows were in milk. Well, that produced enough for around about 20 customers, probably 15 customers maybe. And when it got to the point where there were 20 customers, they were saying, oh, I know other people who might be interested too. I had to rush off and buy another cow in milk and bring her back, another Guernsey somewhere. So I had to find some local Guernsey herd, go off, persuade the farmer to sell me 1 more cow, like that. And I went up one by one by one by one. It was quite hilarious. And then eventually I had to buy a slightly bigger bulk tank, a slightly bigger washing machine for my bottles, and slightly bigger everything. But that way, at least I kept in touch on the financial side and was able to see the development of an interest which was turning itself into something supportable for a farm of that size. And what I did in the meantime, John, is actually I rented out at least 50% of the land to another farmer, next door neighbor, who needed more land on condition that he used no nitrate fertilizers or pesticides. So in other words, I was able to get an income from him while I was building up my own unit. And by the time he got off the land, that land was already converted to organic too. It just needed another couple of years of grass clover lays to bring the fertility back up. I figured out a system of doing it, which did work. Yes, could be enormously frustrating at times. A terrible thing was when the machinery broke down. And, you knew you had to try and get something done and knew it's going to rain tomorrow. And, yeah, that sort of thing.
Well, I can only imagine that kind of frustration, but there must have been some kind of payback, aside from financially, with the produce that you had and the reaction and reception that was given from the people that you were serving.
That's where very positive feedback, you see. I mean, I can't help but see it largely in a positive light. Oh, yes, there were the negative moments. And one of the most difficult negative moments was trying to deal with officialdom, which wasn't used to this sort of thing. It can be hugely frustrating. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment.
Yeah.
But yes, the feedback from the people I was delivering this unpasteurized raw Guernsey milk and cream to, who, was wonderful. And they just said, oh, God, wow, this is sensational. And what happened? Now, this is really amazing, really. By when I came back to England to do it on full time, it was just the beginning of the 1980s, although I set it in motion when I was still abroad. And I started building up. By 1989, I had got up to a herd of about 20 cows, and the rest of the farm was expanding, and I'd taken on some help, paid help. But what happened was that one day in February 1989, the government announced it was going to ban unpasteurized milk. And, they had a reason for this. Actually, that the Milk Marketing Board and the industry, the milk industry in quotes, was a bit worried by the potential for unpasteurized milk to gain a niche market which might affect their market. Well, I'm cynical enough to see that this works. Almost all small-scale businesses run up against this eventually. So what happened was the government came to the conclusion, with the help of the Food Safety Standards Agency, that this was a product which should have been banned years ago because it's got to be dangerous. It's not pasteurized, is it? There might be bacteria in it. And people shouldn't be eating, drinking live foods.
Heaven forbid.
Any dead food is safe food. Anything which has been pasteurized, homogenized, and ultra-heat treated, etc. So anyway, they found a reason for trying to ban it, which was based on a cheese called Brie de Moor, which is a Swiss unpasteurized brie, which apparently contained some listeria pathogens which had been brought into England. And in the process of them trying to trace where it had gone, someone suddenly stood up and said, oh, we've got unpasteurized things in England too, so we must ban it. So they announced suddenly that they were going to be a ban, and I was absolutely horrified, because I was, putting my heart and soul and all my money into my dairy herd, and I got my niche market going. By then I had got quite a lot of customers, maybe 70 or 80 customers at least. And I was contacted by someone who was interested, a cheesemaker actually, and a writer. And he said, we've got to do something. And I said, well, come over to my place. So we sat down there, and as we talked, I suddenly said, I'm going to start a campaign to break that, to stop this happening. And he and I together founded an organization called the Association of Unpasteurized Milk Producers and Consumers. We contacted via the Milk Marketing Board's actual newsletter, which goes out to all farmers at that time, all dairy farmers. And we said, we're starting this organization. Please join if you're interested in trying to fight the proposed government ban. And we got about 250 farmers out of about 400 at that time probably producing raw milk, so just over half. It was a very good response. And then one day, I was about second or third day after this announcement, someone rang me up who was on my milk round. He said, can I help you? So I said, well, that would be nice. I'm afraid I don't know you or what you do. He said, no, that's okay. He said, I live in the village. I'm the main newscaster for ITV television. He said, I heard the story. This story broke. It was actually headline news.
Right.
So they said, can we get up to your farm and do some and film your setup? So I said, my God, can you? Yeah. Bring them up. Bring the crew up here. And oddly enough, it was a Sunday, and I had to sort of recreate the milk round, which didn't happen on a Sunday, and tell my customers, be out there with a glass and say, how enthusiastic you are about the product. So we did all this filming. And then, lo and behold, the BBC wanted to come. So later on the same day, the BBC came and we did the whole thing again. And that night, it was on the main news, both BBC and ITV. And that was extraordinary, because after that, we were running, to keep up with all the people that wanted interviews and this, that, and the other, newspaper reporters. And after 2.5 months, we won. The government backed down. I even had a letter from Mrs. Thatcher saying, I agree that entrepreneurial people are needed in the countryside. Prince Charles was very highly supportive. And the government was completely cracked under all this enthusiasm, which is a wonderful thing, hey? What do you think of that, John?
It's not only wonderful, I think that's really demonstrative of people power and how people can act above bureaucracy and act almost as a watchdog for what's going on around them, rather than just accepting the status quo that we should always live below those so-called higher powers of government and now the EU and any kind of bureaucracy like that. Because what you guys managed to do is a really huge achievement there.
Well, it is actually... Excuse me. It is very true what you're saying. I think that looking back on it in hindsight, actually it happened again 10 years later. They tried again in 1997 to ban it, and we repeated the whole exercise, and again the government backed down. And to this day, now, there's a revival of unpasteurised milk and cream in England, and lots of little micro dairies are picking up, and we've pretty much, in spite of the fact that the Food Standards Agency is, at this very moment we're speaking, reviewing the regulations on unpasteurised milk and is looking for a way to try and restrict it. There's a great groundswell of support that's built up over the years, and I don't think they'll succeed. And I always give them a very hard time now if they get onto me and try and persuade me that this product ought to be banned. And the thing is that we humans, once we get the bit between our teeth, and once we start feeling our higher purpose in life, and that we're defending nature, we're defending, the world is our garden. If we can see that our garden is actually not just a little place that we might own with a fence around it, but it extends out and out and out into the vastness of the planet, which is a garden and should be tended and looked after like an organic garden. If we get that in our gut, that feeling, we get enormous strength and powers and support from higher levels. And with that sort of level of support, we can achieve extraordinary things. I will tell you a little bit later about another equally remarkable event which happened in Poland, but in the story thus far, that was a very amazing experience and a very enriching one for me.
It continued to become more and more enriching if we continue this story, because great strides were made even since then, and not just with regard to milk production, but just in the whole organic movement in general, because it suddenly started to really snowball with you guys at the forefront of it.
It did, and I got onto the board of the Soil. I was elected onto the board of the Soil Association quite early on, actually. So I got very involved in trying to help support the campaigns to expand people's understanding and awareness of what organic food is and what organic farming is. And it was an extraordinary time, and there were a group of about 7 or 8 of us who worked entirely voluntarily for years and years and years and years, and the amount of work we went through in promoting and getting organic established as a concept and as a reality on the ground was enormous, and none of us ever thought we should be asking any money for this. It's a little bit like you hear with people who have great healing powers, spiritual powers probably, and the ones who are the most forthright and able and usually very humble are the ones who say, I'm not going to charge you for this. It's my gift. If you want to offer me something, that's fine, and it would be very helpful. but I feel this is what I'm supposed to do. And I think this group of people all felt that way. And, we shared each other's energy and enthusiasm, and we ran up against almost insurmountable problems continuously. But somehow or other, they were surmounted. But as it got into the 1990s, something started changing, and it was a bit worrying, really, because organic did become recognized, and the small and medium-sized farmers started getting bigger. And mainstream farmers started getting interested in the idea that possibly they could make a little bit more money by going on to organic production, maybe 20% more or whatever. But without having that deep philosophical sense of the meaning of it, just seeing it as a good opportunity. And then the people who sort of led the organic movement became a bit divided. And the majority in the end started going with, we want to get our food into supermarkets, and that's the only way in which the great majority of people in this country and abroad are going to ever know it exists and buy it, because people shop in supermarkets, don't they? 80% possibly. And I held out, having practiced local sales, direct selling, as it's now called. And then I said, if you don't get all your sales direct, then you move a little bit further afield, and then you move a little bit further afield, but you always basically try and sell the thing fresh, optimum condition, seasonal, and local. And that was actually even enshrined into the Soil Association's remit from the beginning. But it swung more and more in favor of those who wanted a sort of big production scenario. And it went into the supermarkets. And once it did that, the supermarkets made their own demand about the way it had to be packaged and processed and mass produced, because they don't accept small amounts. They only accept very large volumes. And then, of course, it has to conform in shape and size. And then there's very large amounts, particularly in the vegetable kingdom, thrown out. And organic producers producing vegetables were telling me 35% of everything they were sent was rejected.
So an example of that might be if a carrot is the wrong colour for a supermarket shelf, or the wrong shape, or it would just be rejected.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly. I mean, it's total insanity. It's got nothing to do with the organic approach. And when we were small and enthusiastic, no one thought about that. We just sold our carrots and things wherever we could, usually through independent retailers or direct to the public in some form. But once the supermarkets took on a controlling influence on the organic side, it slipped. It all started slipping. And it really reached the zenith of problems for me in the late 1990s, when a product which was a pasteurized, semi-skimmed milk, homogenized even, I think, was given an organic symbol. And I said that's the exact opposite of what should be organic. The only way to drink that product is unpasteurized if you want decent health. The other stuff is basically indigestible and ultimately poisonous. And I lost. And, that's the way it went. So I pulled out, really, of the more official organic status promotion, but remain an organic farmer and farm here in Oxfordshire and a little bit in Poland. We'll get to that eventually. But I've now become much more in sympathy with what I would call the general family farm, the traditional family farmer, which you have many in Ireland, who, only uses a very small amount of perhaps nitrate fertilizer occasionally, and who has somehow been forgotten because the press loved the organic. You have organic and you have chemical. This is black and white.
Yeah.
But in between, there were all these very good, honest, humble, long-term farming families who were beavering on, doing very good farming practices, essentially, but using occasionally, like in an emergency, a chemical. And that's ruled out at the organic level. And I began to be more of a campaigner for that type of farm and for the small family farmers, the survival of them, because they were under enormous threat throughout the 1990s and to this day. And in fact, we are losing 20,000 of those farms every year for the last 10 years at least. And it's only because very clever diversification projects and various things like that, and part-time farming, in fact, has come to save those farms from going under. Otherwise, they would have gone completely by now. So you see, it had its great upward time, and then it had its time when it plateaued out and became rather too, I would say, too close to the status quo, too well looked after by industry and to a degree even by government with various forms of subsidies. When you get locked into that scenario, you lose the freedom and independence to be entrepreneurial, and you have to start conforming in order to be sure that you're going to have the income you require to keep going.
And that timeline is very, very interesting because there's quite a bit of cynicism, I would notice, even in my own locality, for example, here in Ireland, with regard to organic. And you mentioned a black and white scenario, and I think that very much exists in the general populace. You have people who are fervently pro-organic to the point of almost zealotry, and then you have those who are completely cynical and anti-organic because they see it as a scam for more money or whatever.
Yeah.
So there's this division, and right in the middle there's this huge swathe of people who are almost, when I'm talking about farmers when I say people here, who are almost ostracized because they apply a certain sensibility to what it is they do, as opposed to this black and white scenario. And I think when it comes to most things in life, there's a huge grey area, and when bureaucracy is introduced, that grey area is almost always ignored to a large degree. And I think that seems to be what you've described with regard to what happened with the organic movement.
Oh, it is, and you put it very well. You see, the people who saw themselves as the sort of leader element within organic farming had very real ambitions about climbing the ladder and getting to the top. And that's a very different thing from only wanting to be a good farmer. It's a completely different thing. Not to say that these people haven't got, very, very made a hugely important contribution to kicking off a sort of new, fresh approach to what was called organic. I mean, actually, organic is a bit of a misnomer, because all farming up until the large majority of farms up until the Second World War were using rotations, were using farmyard manure, were practicing proper animal husbandry, and in effect were virtually organic by default. So what happened in the 1970s and 80s was a reinvention of that under a new name, but they didn't want other people to really realize that it was just an extension of a traditional farming system which had been going for a couple of hundred years. So in a way, it was a bit cheeky to create this whole new world around something called organic, when it had actually pretty much existed in a very similar form many years before then.
The language is quite interesting surrounding it, because even the word organic seems to have become a bastardized form of what it was in the 70s and 80s, and it's become at various times something trendy, which again people will rail against. Certain elements of society will rail against anything that's trendy, and I think again, it just leads to a polarization surrounding the essence of what organic farming should be, and that's about the quality of the produce, and there's a huge health factor involved there as well. Let's talk about that for a little while, Julian, because it's not just about taste, it's not just about sustaining business and entrepreneurial activity. There is also a huge health factor here. It's
a massive health factor. It's so big now in 2014 that, I've just come back from a conference a couple of days ago hitting that issue, that I have to say I would advise everybody listening to this program to shift, if you haven't already, onto organic food or local, fresh food where you know the farmer and you know his production methods. It doesn't have to be certified organic. It's quite expensive for the farmer and involves quite a lot of bureaucracy. It can be just that you find or you hear about people producing food the right way, ecologically, without using very minimal form of toxic pesticides, and producing really good food, which means you, the consumer, have to become more aware. You have to become more knowledgeable about farming systems, have to do your homework, not just expect to be given something. But the health implications are vast, because what has emerged is that the main nitrate fertilizers are basically coming out of the munitions industry. There was a lot of nitrate left over from bomb making, the Second World War, and some bright spark decided that there surely must be another use for that in these times of peace. So they found that actually if you process this product a bit more and throw it on the ground, it makes the grass grow 25% faster than if you don't. And that product, nitrate fertilizer, weakens the stem of the plant and alters its DNA because it gets a rush, a little bit like when you drink a Coca-Cola. You get this sugar rush and then you go down again because you're not stimulating the total immune system. You're not stimulating the body's health. You're getting a sugar rush. You're getting a luxury uptake factor from nitrate. In the 1970s and 60s and 70s, almost all farmers abandoned farmyard manure in favor of nitrate. But they got themselves on what you call the chemical treadmill by doing this. Because as the products, let's say cereals like wheat, barley, oats, etc., got weakened in the stem, so the pests attacked them. Whereas before they might have attacked, but they didn't win the battle. Now they started winning the battle. So the farmers turned back to the agrochemical industry. What are we going to do now? And they said, well, we've got an answer to that. It's called a fungicide, It's also a toxic product. They didn't tell them that. And you spray that on against your bug, the fungicide, is against fungus attacks. Pest attacks is a pesticide. So you've got something called pesticide. And spray that on 3 times during your production system, and that should cure it. And then they got these fungal attacks, a few years later. So what do we do now? We've got fungal. Oh, yeah, we've got another product for that. It's called a fungicide. And you spray that on 5 times. You put the nitrate on twice. And then they said, we've got another problem. So it went on and on and on. And that is what modern farming is, unfortunately. It's entirely reliant on toxic agrochemicals. So when you're eating that food, you are building slowly a toxicity within your own body, which is going to upset your metabolism, your gut, and your immune system. And once those 3 start going, liver and kidney problems will be the first ones to appear, and then your overall health will be affected quite severely in varying ways, many various ways, of course. So the health implications of getting off that type of a diet and onto one where real food is being produced is becoming, for many, many, many people, absolutely crucial. And it's become so important that more people are doing research into what is actually happening. And out of this research, we're learning more and more horror stories, frankly. I have to be honest about it. I like many of the farmers very much who still are, unfortunately, using these methods. But the reality for the buyer is that what they're ingesting shouldn't be called food. And it should be called something else. It should have a health warning on it, essentially, like cigarettes, And the health implications of some of the herbicides being used are now in the front line, along with genetic modification of food. Genetic modification of food is the height, is the very top of the agrochemical pyramid. Here you've got something moving into a virtual reality world. It's a laboratory food. You've got genes taken from, let's say, an Icelandic cod and put into a tomato, and the resulting product is supposed to be something which you could ship from California to London without it freezing or going mushy in the airplane hold, because the cod gene has that effect on the tomato. But they claim that it's no different than an ordinary tomato, and you have to be extremely foolish to believe anything like that. Once you've injected a completely different species, which would never, in nature, cross-fertilize. You wouldn't have tomatoes and cods cross-fertilizing with one another. You couldn't possibly get away without altering the entire DNA of the product. And the trouble is, we now start discovering, maybe 20 years later after the first invention of this type of food, that the effects of feeding genetically modified animal feed to animals is very deleterious. And the most recent research projects done by independent laboratories, and it's very different from the results that you get from the industry's research, like Monsanto. The independent laboratory researchers, 5 different research stations in Europe at the highest level, and I'd say very, very reputable organizations, have all come up with the same results when rodents were fed a diluted diet of the typical GMO animal feed fed to cows and pigs and chickens en masse today. And that feed, which is largely either soya or maize, incidentally, genetically modified soya and maize, a lot of it grown in North America or Brazil, Argentina, is extraordinary. They fed it to mice, and after 1 year, the mice developed extreme lesions of the kidneys and the liver. In the second year, towards the end of the second year, they became infertile, that is, incapable of reproducing. And after about 5 years, they died an early death. 4 years might have been. And this was reproduced independently, totally independently, in 5 different countries. In Russia, at the Academy of Sciences, in France at the Hyde laboratory with Professor Sorolini leading the team, in Italy and in England. It started with Professor Pushtai finding that potatoes were not the same when they're genetically modified as they are when they're normal. And for revealing that fact back in about 1995, he was immediately thrown out of the Rowett Institute in Scotland overnight, and all his papers were seized, and he was told never to breathe a word about that again. So you can see that there was something going on there which the public were being completely kept in the dark about. So when you put it all together, the genetic modification of food and the agrochemical things, that you've got to, if you're going to take your destiny in your own hands and your children's destinies, you've got to find another lifestyle. You've got to find another approach whereby you can have constant access on a daily level to real healthful foods.
And I can just imagine some people thinking now, well, John and Julian, that's all very well, but the price of organic food and the time and effort it takes to go out and find a farmer. I live in the middle of a busy city, for example. How am I going to go out and find a farmer who's going to provide me with crooked carrots, which I don't like the look of? I can't serve those up to my dinner guests or my kids or whatever it is. I'll just go to the local Tesco and I'll buy my proper carrots that have never done me or my parents or my family any harm to date. Any issues that may arise, well, we'll deal with those as they come, because we've got medicine, don't we? And it's more advanced than it's ever been. So what would you say to those people?
Very right, absolutely. What I would say to those people is you have to do your research. Now, the thing about health is this. You can be feeling fine for long periods of time, and then very suddenly you can have a major health problem around the corner. People are all different, actually. I mean, first of all, you have to accept the fact that some people have very strong metabolisms, and some people have rather weak metabolisms, some people have in-between metabolisms, etc., and immune system strength, and all the rest of it. Some people can eat pretty much junk food almost all their life and get away with it, and maybe be in their 90s before they die. Other people with more sensitive organs, whatever, probably can't. But it's a twofold issue, because what health is about is not only about our own health, which I call selfish health. It's about the health of the planet altogether. It's about the health of the environment, the health of the soil, the health of trees, rivers, water. If you're going to buy and support a system that produces food which is destroying all those things, every time you go to Tesco, and you're supporting what you call factory-farmed chickens and pigs. Typically, in the case of chickens, let's say, 5,000 chickens living in a shed with no light, daylight, only neon lights, strip bulbs, in cages where they can only just turn around, being fed genetically modified food with antibiotics in them, living for 3 months when they could live for 5 years. You are supporting something which is a concentration camp for animals. Every time you buy that product, you are supporting that way of life. There's no way one can deny it. Only by changing your attitude about what you feel about the world and how you want to support the future of this planet and its ecology and its diversity and the quality of the foods, It's a long-term issue. You see, health isn't a short-term issue. You can get away with it? Maybe. But the real price of good health is taking a serious interest in the totality of the situation, not just in how you feel. Because ultimately, if you might get away with it, the next generation most certainly won't. If genetically modified food is causing sterility in mice, over a period of 1.5 years, it'll cause sterility in all human beings in 20. And in fact, if you look at the statistics for America, it has been eating GM foods, and 90% of all soya, all maize, and many other things are genetically modified in America. The highest rates in the Western world of sterility are there. You know, the sperm count has dropped. Women are finding it extremely difficult to get pregnant. And it's the beginning, but only just the beginning, of what could be a massive genocide on the human race. And it sounds all terribly extreme, but the fact is, I'm giving warning. I've done the work, I've done the research, I've had the experience of being a farmer from both sides, and I can tell the consumer that if they care about their health and the health of the planet, they're strongly advised to move away from mass-produced factory foods, which are containing pesticide residues, even if those haven't yet hurt you, and are gradually destroying and causing sterility in the soil. So that by the time 2 generations ahead are coming along, the legacy that we'll be passing to them will be complete disaster. And that is what we should be considering in our lives, not just our own selfish health.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there, and it reminds me a little bit of the ticking time bomb, because while the danger mightn't immediately seem obvious on a day-to-day level, eventually when that timer counts down to 0, there'll be an absolute explosion of unprecedented proportions with regard to global health. And that is where we're headed, because the research, as you say, is being done and has been done independently. And if you look at that research and study it very, very carefully, there is only one conclusion, and that's that we're in for a massive, massive awakening. And let's just hope the awakening comes before it's too late, because it could easily be the case that things are irreversible. And you mentioned very, very early on in our conversation that there could be a cross-contamination with regard to GMO and organic foods. And that's a major issue for organic growers in regions that have fully embraced GMO. Can you talk a little bit about that and what the implications are and what exactly that means, Julian?
Yes, certainly. Cross-contamination between GMO and organic foods, or even what we call conventional foods, which would be typical of what many family farmers are producing and are close to being organic but not specifically organic. This cross-contamination is inevitable if genetically modified crops are being grown. It is inescapable, actually. And it's very obvious. I think a child could have worked it out. You have a transgenic product containing the genes of other plants, which have actually, in some cases, some of these genes, no relation to the plant kingdom at all, growing in a field next to yours. All you require really is a good gale, and the pollen blows straight through, and that pollen mixes with the pollen of the plants you're growing, and it will ultimately get into the DNA of your plants. Bees forage normally at distances of up to 5 kilometers from where they normally, from their local hives. They, of course, cross-pollinate, and they choose different plants, and they cross-pollinate plants. They will be cross-pollinating. Insects will be cross-pollinating. Birds will be cross-pollinating. People walking between these crops, tractors, everything will be opening up more and more and more possibilities of cross-contamination. And would you believe the government, in England and various other countries that still support GMO, says, oh no, all you need is a 20-meter barrier, and you'll be fine. A 20-meter barrier, which is a blank piece of ground or some form of crop, which is the intermediary between these two, and it'll be fine. Well, you see, the thing is, when you hear this, you realize that they're totally bought out. Nobody who knows anything about food and farming or biology or nature could possibly swallow that nonsense. So you think, well, what are they doing? What are these government officials up to? And then you start doing that research and you see, oh my heavens, this is so extreme that the industry has convinced the lobbyists from Monsanto and DuPont and Pioneer and Syngenta and ICI, and they've all, come in there with so much money and so many glossy magazines and well-paid scientists to back it all up, and they've simply convinced government ministers that is modern farming, That is what's needed if you want to keep at the cutting edge of modernity and moving forward. And if you also want our support at election time, and I think you probably do, don't you, Minister? Then you go with us. And that is the level of corruption which is ubiquitous in Europe and North America and probably the world. And there, the public have to make the next major choice. You're going to go on supporting that thing called democracy when you can see it's not remotely interested in your welfare and in your future? I hope not. And that starts to expand the mind. And then you start putting together your health awareness with your social and political awareness, and you gradually start acquiring the bigger picture. And in fact, just to interject at this point there, I have written 2 books on this subject. One's called Changing Course for Life, Local Solutions to Global Problems, came out 3 years ago. And the most recent one, which came out just a couple of months ago, is In Defense of Life, essays on the radical reworking of green wisdom. And the reason I brought the books out is to really try and take people through the stages of awareness, and so that by the time they get to the end of reading these books, they actually get the whole picture. They can see it from the political angle, from the environmental angle, they can see it from the social angle, from the spiritual angle, and they can see it from all the different backgrounds, and it all points one way, which is what you were saying earlier on, that we have to actually start taking control of our own destinies. We have to start making the decisions. And I suggest, if you're interested in politics, that we need to do it locally, because you're not going to change these people in high office. It's worth trying, and one must try. But actually, the reality is that we need to go right back to the grassroots beginning again, to the community, almost to the tribe, and start from our villages and small towns, recreating that community, making the decisions which are important for ourselves at the community level, and simply, in certain cases, absolutely refusing to go along with this now completely hijacked form of democracy, which is ruining our planet.
And I think it's a form of democracy, and I use the word advisedly, we'll use inverted commas there for democracy, but I think it is a form of democracy that relies heavily on a tacit consent from the people. And by various methods, there is a lot of distraction to divert people's attention away from real issues. And this is a real issue, and you mentioned grassroots level. And the way society seems to be structured, certainly in the Western world at the moment, it seems to be that there are so many distractions that take away or divert our attention from the grassroots level, and that's the only place that things can be changed. And I think that's very clearly outlined, particularly in Changing Course for Life, Local Solutions to Global Problems, because it is only at a local level that global problems can be solved, because everything stems from there. And I think if people choose to ignore it, well, then it is a tacit acceptance. We have a responsibility to ourselves and to the generation that follows us and to everybody around us to actually grab the bull by the horns and take some kind of issue with that's harmful to us. And I think it begins with what we put in our bodies, because everything stems from there. Absolutely right.
It is absolutely the case that the need to take a non-passive position is the first major stepping stone for anybody that wants to free themselves from the treadmill. And we are all educated, unfortunately, to believe that people in higher office and what they can now call experts have some genuine knowledge which we need to absorb and use in our lives. But as we grow older and see the way the world works, we understand more and more that it's skewed. And it's always skewed in favor of one thing, the accumulation of wealth. Therefore, the truth suffers enormously to the degree to which the elements of truth left in what is called democracy become so small that the crisis reaches proportions which demand radical change. And we are at this tipping point of needing radical change. And it is going to be a people's-led radical change. It has to be. because of the extremity of the situation. And people have to get off their backsides and stop being passive. It's going to be difficult, and it is extremely difficult. You see, the people who are on what you might call the controlling influence in society, extremely clever. They're in the background, some of them. You don't actually see their names, but they're certainly in the top end of the banking trade, that's for sure. They've worked out the psychology of the human being to a perfection. They're geniuses, some of them. And they know that they can divert your concentration very easily by putting another little pleasure up in front of you, or a new gizmo to play with, or a new car, or whatever it might be, a new holiday in some exotic place. There's always that which seems to get the upper hand over people's deeper, intuitive concentration and ability to develop their own vision of the future and work together to ensure that vision takes place. Now, I'm going to give an interesting example of how, once you do take the bull by the horns and start working with other people in that spirit, you can achieve amazing things. You heard about the Real Milk campaign and how that achieved it. Yeah. Well, in the year 2000, I met up with a remarkable woman from Poland called Jadwiga Łopata, who just founded an organization called the International Coalition to Protect the Polish Countryside, and she grew up on a very small farm, a little small holding, with a large family, and they all survived on the land very well, ate extremely good food, managed to earn a small amount of money, just enough to make life possible. And she went later on and worked and went to university in Krakow and studied mathematics, and soon realized that this wasn't really going to be for her, and came back to the countryside again and started helping the small farmer. She saw the writing on the wall for the small farmer in Poland, because the EU was about to get its grips on Poland, and the big industries were going to move in. Well, I met her in a conference in London in 2000, and she invited me to come and be a co-director of the International Coalition to Protect the Polish Countryside. And at that point, I just started winding down some of my farming work, hands-on work, and passing them over to other people who had already proved themselves as being very capable. And so I decided I would do this. And I went over to Poland, and to cut a long story short, I'm still working there today, more than I am in England at the moment. And one of the first campaigns, which I said to Jadwiga, I think we need to try and concentrate on, is to stop genetically modified organisms getting into the food chain in Poland. And no one in Poland even had heard about genetically modified food. It was a completely new idea, really. But I said, from my experience in England, I've discovered that if you work more at the local level and make people aware of what the dangers are, they're more likely to be responsive than if you go straight to government. They're tempted at that level. They're not going to bother to listen to you. Yeah. So we worked out a sort of campaign strategy which involved going to meet some figures in the provincial governments, of which there are 16 provinces in Poland, each governed by a board, and I had a chairman of that board. And through good fortune and a connection of Jadwiga's, we met a man who had some influence within his province, and we warned him that if you go down that road, it'll be the end of the reputation of Poland for having real proper peasant farmhouse foods, which people are still looking for today. It will disrupt the biodiversity of nature, which is a marvelous thing in that country. More biodiversity in Poland than anywhere else in Europe still remains. Something like 40,000 pairs of nesting storks is a very good example. Masses of wildflowers still, good quality water available, etc. And we warned them that this would be the beginning of the end of all that, and that tourism would ultimately be affected, all the rest of it. And we got the message through. That state, we said, what you can do is make a symbolic gesture. You can try and persuade your board that you can set yourself up as a GMO-free zone. So the state of Podkarpacia, in this particular case, could be a GMO-free zone. It'll be symbolic, but it'll be a powerful message, and it'll alert the press and other people. And they did. And then we invited him to come and give a talk in Malopolska province, which is where we're based. And he did. And we worked on the board there, and the board also adopted it. And it went from one to another to another. This is in 2004, 2005. And by 2006, we had the whole of Poland declared GMO-free zone.
Amazing.
The whole of Poland, 16 provinces, every one of them, the chairman of the boards had come up with a statement and it said, we propose to keep our province free from GMO for the following reasons. We were astounded, of course, but we then said to them, the next thing for you to do, because it's a very powerful voice, political voice, obviously, is to write to the president of Poland and say you demand a ban of the import and planting of genetically modified organisms, seeds particularly, of course. And they did. And 3 months later, he banned it. The president of Poland banned the import and planting of GMO. And that campaign had really been launched and run by, let's say, 4 or 5 people, of which Vigor and I were the sort of starting point. And so I hope that gives people a chance to, once they've absorbed it, to realize that we have this enormous potential. If we get on the side of nature and the forces of good and the forces of light, the forces of diversity, everything which is beautiful about life, which is strong, which is passionate. Again, as I said about the milk campaign, we will be given unusual powers of influence, and we will be able to make change, even critical point in time, which I think you were saying, it is a race against time now.
Yeah.
Therefore, we need to be able to adopt this type of passion, this type of belief faster than just waiting for it to happen to us. Today, unfortunately, it's the government. Well, the government, in 2006, that put through this ban. Incidentally, they also said they were going to ban animal feed, GM animal feed, about a year later. 6 months later, that government was out. There was a massive reaction, a kickback by sort of multinational corporations and various people who put money into governments, and they said, we can't have this, no way. And they were out, and the government that replaced them was much more open to doing deals with the industry and with the European Union, for that matter. Since then, we've had a much harder job in holding the line, but we just about have, and still to this day, Poland is a GMO-free zone, essentially, and we have many more people who are aware of what the implications are of that failing, and we hope we've been able to secure it in the long term.
And what are your hopes and your expectation then as we move into this critical time, Julian? I mean, not just in Poland, but globally. Poland is certainly demonstrative of what can be done when even a small group of people decide to take decisive action and to choose their own path. But globally, what do you think we're looking at? Are you positive about the outcome, or what way do you think it will go?
Well, globally, what I've said, of course, applies globally. We have a staggering range of different cultures and levels of awareness around the world that we don't even know quite what's going on in many places. But one thing we have all in common is something called life. And you find in poorer countries of the world and in countries that still operate close to the ground, peasant agricultural communities in Africa and India and South America and all over, an enormously rich spirit, an enormously tough skin, tolerance of everything which is disastrous. And if those people, and I'm talking about a high percentage of the world's population, maybe 5 billion out of 7 billion, fit that category. If we can help them to hold on to their traditional ways of life and hold on to their swapping of their native seeds and hold on to the traditions which have endured for thousands of years, which have enabled them to learn how to work with nature rather than against it. And if we can teach them the dangers of the international, multinational corporation, which are governments in, so to speak, working hand in hand with them, coming to their countries and demanding that they give up that way of life and that they provide the elements of capital and minerals and oil and all the rest of it that the West needs to carry on its completely unsustainable lifestyle. If we can help them to see that danger before they're wiped out by it, the world will be changed, will be saved. If we fail in that, and the corporations simply do push their way in, and people fall for the sugary descriptions of what they will get as a result of this, which is slavery, frankly, sweatshops and all the rest of it, and their countries and their biodiversity ruined forever, then we will have a total catastrophe on the planet. So in a very humanitarian way, I'm not really dealing quite yet with the spiritual implications, but on a very humanitarian level, those people are the ones we have to get to and get the message to, that what we have achieved in the West and in North America is unsustainable. The experiment is a failure. If you adopt it, you will go down exactly the wrong route. Hang on to what you've got already. Re-research your roots. Stick with your indigenous agricultural methods. And you will pull through. In fact, you might even become the leader ultimately in the world, because those small-scale units are the future, in my view, and the large-scale ones will break down as oil becomes too expensive and as the soil becomes too sterile and as the weeds overtake the ability of the herbicides, etc., to destroy them. We are going to have to work our way back to the smaller scale, ecologically managed peasant farms. And those examples exist in indigenous countries all over the world. And if they can be robust enough to hold on in there, and the message spreads back out again from them, the planet, I believe, will be saved. And I am optimistic, essentially, yes.
And I think there is a spiritual factor there as well. You very, very briefly mentioned it. And with all indigenous cultures, that was a huge part of anything physical that they did, whether it was to do with the land or anything else. Spirituality was very much at the centre of that. And I think you'd probably agree with me when I say there's been a huge disconnect in the Western world between spirituality and pretty much everything else that we do or perceive.
Yes. How right you are. Anyway, yes, I mean, so true. The word, it actually, the beauty of working in Poland is that people are very, very open to that level. There's a much deeper raft of spiritual awareness in that country. And so, you use the word spiritual and people are quite at home with it. I mean, okay, they will be using it in the majority, probably in the fairly standard Catholic sense of how it's used in the church. But adoration of Mother Mary and Jesus is not wrong. It's just that it has to go further. So there, I feel much more comfortable on a spiritual level. In England, I feel it's exactly the opposite. And people seem terrified of it, It's like a threat. What? Spiritual? Oh, help, As long as that remains, that disconnect, things will always be getting worse. There's no doubt about that. And I think all this enormous flooding, which is now taking place in my backyard in England, is going to get worse still. And it is going to be seen in apocalyptic terms by the end of this month. People will be remembering stories, biblical stories of great floods and great acts of nature which virtually destroyed the planet. But you see, on the karmic level, this country, England, has been responsible for the most heinous crimes in its colonization and empire building. And almost nobody in this country today even wants to talk about that. And this is truly shocking. So what happens? You get retribution. It's not personal. It's impersonal. And it's necessary because it's a form of cleansing. There's going to be a vast cleansing taking place. And that is going to take many forms, and they'll be very extreme, depending on where you live. Climate is going to change. But out of it, somewhere in the future, is going to come the seeds of a huge and glorious type of hope. The sun will shine again, and mankind will discover its true nature and how we deviated so far from that. And this is simply, I think, it's probably a law of physics. You don't even have to get into the spiritual. But the spiritual is an intuitive way of understanding how life works, as opposed to a book understanding of it, or an academic one, or a scientific one. And the intuitive one is our gift. And if people can give themselves the time and have the patience and the calm to listen, they will be guided through this time we're in, actually. And they will find great richness, and they will find that they have the powers to stand up amidst the storm and actually go forwards, genuinely forwards, maybe for the first time. And those people will join together. We call it ARCs. We have a series of workshops in Poland called Quit the Matrix, Build the Arc, with which anyone listening to this program is very welcome. What we're doing there is making people aware of the simple issues which we all need to take on board again, and so that we can work together, those of us who are feeling that we have a similar vibrational connection with each other, similar vision. And we will be building arcs, and those arcs we'll be building all over the world, and they will connect with each other eventually. And we'll be rebuilding from the grassroots level. And I think, hopefully, that's the future.
And fingers crossed it is. And I think one thing that people could possibly be mindful of is that the Earth itself is a single organic entity, and it's not just the little parts of it that we see. So quite often, I think we lose a sense of the wood for only seeing the trees. Nature has a way of redressing the balance, and it might be over 20,000 years, it might be over 20 million years, it might be over 2 years, it could be in the space of 2 hours, for example, with a flood or whatever. But nature knows what's best for itself, and that transcends any of our multinational companies or our quest for profit. And I think that's where spirituality ties into things. And essentially, it appears to me, both with our conversation and with the books, Julian, that you're advocating a return to humanity, and allied with that is a spirituality. It's an all-encompassing entity, as opposed to just let's look at milk, or let's look at GMO, or let's look at A, B, C or D. It's this wholeness that we seem to have lost over generations and generations.
Well said, beautifully put. And exactly that, of course it is. And, anyone can have this experience. Anyone can draw that out of themselves in the end. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing when it starts to emerge in you. You just feel so buoyed up by it. You feel so well, physically and mentally and spiritually, and you just delight, and you offer back the fruits of this every day to the Creator that created you and the planet. And you create a symbiotic relationship with what is called God. And the more symbiotic it becomes, the more power both the God gets and you get. And this is a fantastic phenomena which we'll never understand intellectually, because it's well beyond the intellect. It's a deep, 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 deep thing. It's bottomless in its depth. And that is life itself, which is why I called my new book In Defense of Life, quite simply. Because life itself needs defending now, and you defend it by getting involved with it, not by sitting and waiting or praying even, or by, whatever means you might think is going to help your little patch survive. You've got to get out there now, get into the bigger picture, understand the connections, and enjoy it, because it's a great, great thing.
For those who are interested, Julian, as we begin to tie things up, what are the websites and how can people buy the books? Yes,
well, the website is www.julianrose.info, and on that website you will find all the information about the projects and about the two books, Changing Course for Life and In Defense of Life, and how to get them. Incidentally, you can get the most recent one, In Defense of Life, also on Amazon.com and from bookshops. It's quite widely distributed, whereas on the first one, Changing Course for Life, not so much so, but you can get it through writing to me, which you will find how to contact me, how to contact the author, I think it says, on the website. And we would be delighted to hear, of course, from anybody who wishes to purchase a book, or even who wants to make any comments or tell me a life story.
Be careful what you wish for. You might get quite a number of those.
Okay, I'll pull back on that. No, life stories in one paragraph, please.
Fantastic. Well, we will get the links up on the website. Have you any parting message for anybody who might be fascinated or might be resistant to what we were talking about today?
Yes, I do. I think things probably just relax, And you don't get here to this point by worrying. The greatest block is fear. Fear is the greatest block. We cannot get to our true selves with fear. Now, fear is also important. You know, if you're walking towards the edge of a cliff, or you're going to try and cross a busy road, you know, without any traffic lights and cars are whizzing to and fro, you need that instinct of fear to stop you. So I'm not saying don't be afraid, but I'm saying don't be afraid of the bigger issue. It's a beautiful, warm, welcoming hand, actually. So there's nothing to be frightened of. It's just a question of opening your heart, opening your mind. And I would say, for those people who have a very busy lifestyle, who are probably urban-based, it's going to be important to try and be less busy and to try and find some time where you can sit quietly, do some yoga exercises or some meditation, whatever it might be, something on the spiritual route, just to get you started, just to get the thing underway, put a bit of fuel in the tank. And but that really, everybody has a different situation in life. No two people are alike. We all have our different ways of absorbing information and of feeling what can and can't be done. But underneath it all, we have been imbued with powers which have hardly been tapped at all yet. And the future is a very exciting one because we're going to be tapping those powers more and more and more.
I have the power, you have the power, we have the power. Julian Rose, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Alchemy Radio.